Hey everyone, what's going on? I am Tim Bursons from Amplified Vitality, and in today's video I want to talk a little bit about the economy of energy within cells, how this relates to structure and function, and how function helps to create the structure of the organism as far as the way that the cells work and the way that they produce energy. And then I want to kind of compare that to the actual economy and lessons that we're learning right now with this coronavirus epidemic and how it's shutting down the economy, and how we can compare the microcosm and the macrocosm, looking at those patterns and trying to understand what we can glean, what insights and wisdom we can glean between the two. Now, before I dive into this, I do want to let you know that the March edition of the Amplified Vitality Monthly newsletter is live on my Patreon account. Lots of good information in there, nutritional insights, research, some wisdom and life insights and things like that as well. It's a really great edition. I recommend checking it out on my Patreon account below. I also recommend signing up for my email list so that you can keep in touch with all the things that I'm up to, different podcasts that I'm doing, different videos, and more free content, plus a couple of free gifts, including a hepatic insulin resistance research document that contains 10 different studies that I dive into to explain my view on hepatic insulin resistance. So I recommend you check those two things out. Now, diving into today's video, I think that whenever we look at any system within life, we always want to understand the patterns that underlie it. And the reason is because the patterns that underlie any system within any area of life, whether it's psychology, sociology, human endeavor, biology and physiology, or even physics and chemistry and things like that, they're all based on similar patterns. And you can find these patterns throughout many different areas of life. And this is actually the reason that metaphors work so well, because metaphors are actually coded with the same pattern that helps you to take one thing that's very easily understood, apply it to a new system, and then understand that system much more easily. So once you understand these patterns of life, you can start to look at new areas that you are unfamiliar with and understand them very, very quickly. So as a quick little example, one of the patterns that I think is most useful for people, and I'll probably do a full video on this, is the pattern of simple, complex, simple. So Bruce Lee has this quote, this passage where he talks about, in the beginning, a punch is just a punch, and you're a beginner, you're just punching. In the intermediate stage, a punch becomes much more complex. Now you have to worry about how your fist is shaped, how your elbow is, putting your body weight into it, making sure that all the dynamics of the punch are perfect. But then once you pass through that intermediate stage, a punch is just a punch again. At the expert stage, you don't think about all those complexities. You've learned them in the intermediate stage, you've passed through that gate, and so now it's just very, very simple. So this pattern of simple, complex, simple is found throughout all of life. Any endeavor, any skill that you want to learn is always characterized by that pattern of starting very simple, moving into something more complex and intricate, and moving into simple again once you're in the mastery stage, in the expert stage. So that's just one example of a pattern that is found in many different areas of life. Similarly, we can see that everybody's individual world is both a microcosm of the macrocosm, following similar patterns, and that each person is also a macrocosm that contains many microcosms within them. So if you go down to the cellular level, you can say that a single cell is following similar patterns that you as an entity are following. And then similarly, you as an entity are following patterns that are being exhibited across the entire world, across the entire population of humanity. So in a way, you can think that the population of humanity is an individual entity, an organism, and you are just a cell operating within this entity. And then similarly, you are a single entity, and all the individual cells are all operating as a part of the whole, as the collective that makes up you. So there's all these zooming in and zooming out, these fractals and holographic universe type of ideas that come into play with this. So when we're looking at something like structure and function, which is one of the core principles to understand in the bioenergetic world, is that the function will create the structure, meaning that using the system creates the materials and the processes that become the structure that allows the function to flow through it. And so if you have something where you're not creating a lot of energy, for example, something like a very primordial anaerobe that wasn't able to respirate very properly and create tons of energy, the structure of their energetic system looks a lot different than the human who needs to create a lot more energy. And the reason is because the function of what they're using the system for it's not necessary to have a very complex structure to create more energy. They just don't need that much energy. But as we have evolved, we've pushed the boundaries of what we need in the terms of function. We need to function more. We need to create more energy. And as we do that, the structure starts to emulate that function, to adapt to it so that the structure can now maintain the function. So this has very obvious implications for your energy production, as far as whether you're in the healthy metabolism that's producing lots of energy, very strong glucose metabolism, lots of CO2 production, lots of ATP production, plenty of energy for hair, skin, and nail quality, for digestive strength, for sexual drive and motivation and abstract thinking. All of these things are fueled by higher energy processes, which require a structure that is built on a constant use of that function flowing through it. And so a simple way that we can understand this, in a much more day-to-day example that I think a lot of people can grasp, is that of the economy. And when I say the economy, I mean monetary, the currency economy. And especially when we're looking at what's happening with this virus that's going around right now, where the economy is starting to shut down, the function of the economy is starting to shut down, which is stressing the organism of the economy to the point where if it gets too low, the structure is going to start degrading. And in fact, in some ways, the structure already is degrading, but it's a question of how far it goes to whether the entire organism collapses or whether it's just a stress that then the organism recovers from. So economy is basically the number and the amount of the transactions that occur within a group of individuals. So if you want to think about it, every time you buy something, someone else is selling it to you. And so that's a transaction. And in the book, The Richest Man in Babylon, which is a fable-like story that talks about how money and finances and economy work, they go through this very good example that helps you to see that if someone were to pay someone to build them $1 million house, then at the end of this transaction, the person now who built the house now has $1 million in cash, in liquid equity, and the person who has the house now has an asset that's worth $1 million. So before it's actually built, the person who has the $1 million, obviously they still have $1 million, but the person who is going to be building the house doesn't have that. Maybe they have the materials and so there's some value there, but there's certainly not $2 million in total value. However, once the transaction occurs, now because the seller has $1 million and because now the buyer has an asset worth $1 million, the total amount of net currency or net value has increased. And so the more transactions that happen within all of the number of transactions with the entire economy, then the stronger the economy gets, because it means that now there's more value pumping through the system. So in the exact same way as with cells, the function is creating the structure. The more that you have that money flowing through it, the more that we're transacting, the more number of transactions happening between individuals within the whole, the stronger that economy is going to be, the stronger the value system is going to be, the more value people are going to have within their individual lives. And in fact, when we talk about the strength of the economy, and we're talking about, booms and recessions and things like that, the strength of the economy is really about the trust that people will have to continue transacting so that the value of the entire system can continue to grow. And that's also why you have a lot more control over your individual personal economy and finances, is because you can always start giving more value to the world in any way possible. Any way that you start adding value to the world, and especially if you start reciprocally charging money for that value, now you're giving someone something that is worth something valuable to them, and you're getting money which is valuable to you, so both of you are now elevated into a higher state of value. And remember, money is only value. That's all it is. It's just a symbol that we use to denote value exchange between different people. So anyway, when the economy is strong, it means that there's a lot of transactions happening. The reason that we can go into recessions is because fear makes people hold on to their money in a scarcity-based mindset, which now no longer allows the transactions to occur, meaning the function of the system slows. The function of the economy starts to slow because there's fewer transactions of lesser amounts. And so the structure starts to degrade. And so certain business enterprises start to collapse. Certain industries start to suffer and cannot maintain themselves because in order to continue to have the capital required in order to provide that service, they need people to be buying it. And if people stop buying it, the capital gets to a low enough point that the actual system collapses. And now that industry is no longer an option, a viable option. It can no longer be offered to people. And so that's what would be considered in the organism of the economy as death. The economy could be stressed as an organism. If it collapses, then that's the death of the organism. So obviously we can draw some very similar parallels here to the human body. All of the cells making up your body are all like individual people who are all transacting internally with themselves, creating energy, and with each other as far as releasing different energetic molecules like glucose or fatty acids or lactate or any of the other energy producing organic molecules that we have. So in the same way that the strength of the structure of the economy is based on the function, the number of transactions, and the amount of the transactions, we can see that the health of the organism and the structure and the strength of the organism is going to be based on the function, the transactions, the number of glucose or fatty acid molecules that are able to be broken down into ATP, supplying energy and value for those cells to be functioning properly. And in the similar way, as the cell starts to get into a stressed place of scarcity, which is why the emotional energy field of fear is so tightly regulated into this scarcity, low energy state of the body, because that fear of not being willing to transact or to create energy from these food particles creates a state where the function slows, which now starts to degrade the structure to a primordial and lower form, meaning that those higher functioning industries within the body, like I said before, skin, hair, nails, digestive strength, sex, drive, motivation, abstract thinking, all of those kinds of things, those industries start to fall apart. The structure starts to degrade because there is no longer the function going through it, the capital or energy going through it, in order to maintain them, because there's a certain input required simply to maintain it. And therefore you have to have the function happening strongly enough that the structure is maintained. And so obviously all this comes down to that scarcity versus abundance state that I'm always talking about. Whenever you are in a scarcity state, whether that's emotionally or physiologically, your body's not going to want to burn the food particles, the fat and the glucose. So it's not going to want to burn those molecules for energy, turning them into energy charge of the cells for the cells to actually function properly and use the energy the way that they want. In a scarcity state, the body is worried about not having enough energy in the future, and so it wants to hoard. It has this excess mentality of wanting to hoard and hold on and protect, because if it can do that, then it can prolong its survival. Of course, again, a perfect example with the economy, we see that people are hoarding supplies, hoarding toilet paper, hoarding hand sanitizer, and all these other things like this. And the reason is because that scarcity mindset of, we don't know if we're going to have these materials in the future, we want to extend our survival, so we're going to hold on to it. But of course, as a simple example of game theory, this leads to a lower quality of life for everyone. A simple example of game theory, let me explain that real quick, is basically that if you have two different people and there's four different outcomes of a situation, either I trust you and you trust me and we're at the top, or I trust you but you don't trust me and screw me over. And so now you are elevated and I'm suppressed. Or the reverse, where you trust me and I don't trust you, and so I screw you over and I elevate and you suppress. Or we both don't trust each other and we both fall down to a lower level. So obviously what's best for everyone is for everyone to trust each other and stay up in that higher field. But of course, there's always this scarcity and fear-based mentality that wants you to not trust other people and fall down into that lower state. And of course, there's also naivety to be considered in this. It's not a matter of not taking care of yourself or not thinking through and being logical and using common sense. But as a very basic overview, this sort of game theory model of thinking is very much involved in the economy. Because if people could continue to trust and have faith, the economy would not be affected by something like this. But as soon as you move into scarcity, that means you collapse. That means you fall out and now want to take for yourself and hold on and hoard. And it's that excess hoarding mentality that the body is doing when it's in a higher fat state and in a lower functioning energy state, because it doesn't want to turn the food particles, again, fatty acids and glucose, it doesn't want to turn those into energy, into ATP, into the electrochemical gradient of the cell that supplies all the energy to allow it to do all those complex functions, fueling the structure of those more complex industries within the body that are all of those higher functioning abilities like the skin, hair, nails, and all the stuff I talked about already. So now the question is, how do you move out of this and how do you come back to a place of abundance where your physiology is actually functioning in a way that's producing a lot of energy, keeping the energy charge of the cells high, burning through the food and fuel that you're eating rather than being in this hoarding mentality and this mindset? And There's a lot of different physical things we can do. I talk about these a lot on my channel. There's a lot of different individual systems or industries involved, like gut health and the microbiome, the adrenals and catecholamines that represent the stress hormones, thyroid health, even immune health and respiration and acid-base balance. There's so many different systems involved here that I very much like diving into the complexity of it and helping to share that with people so they can get a better idea of how that's happening. And there's a lot of different action steps that we can take in any of those fields. But in this video, I just want to share some tricks for helping to shift out of the mind state, out of the emotional energy field, mental emotional energy field that creates that fear and scarcity. And while this is cutting edge, newly emerging in the scientific fields of health and understanding how the body and the emotions interact, I do truly believe that the body follows the emotions. And if you're consistently in a fear-based, guilt-based, shame-based, anger-based, negative emotion-based energy field all the time, that either your body naturally will respond to that energy field by functioning in a poorer state, and or you will unconsciously choose actions that will promote less health and promote more of a scarcity-based mindset or scarcity-based physiology to reflect the energy field that you are constantly inhabiting within your mental emotional space. So in other words, the body follows the mind. And we've seen, obviously there's so many stories about how the placebo effect, for example, or how people can actually think themselves into a death state or think themselves into sickness. And of course, how negative emotions actually drop your immunoglobulin A and raise cortisol, and then gratitude does the reverse. And so there's all of these different areas that we can see. The body does follow the mind. And I don't think that it's just a magical, energy field type of thing. I think that definitely plays a role in it. But I think it's also about unconsciously choosing actions where, if you're always in fear and guilt and you're in this excess hoarding mentality, well, now whenever something pleasurable comes along, a food that is really pleasurable but doesn't make you feel good, it just gives you that quick dopamine hit, well, you're going to want to hoard it real quick and take it all in because you don't know when the next hit of pleasure is going to come. Whereas if you're in a constantly pleasurable life all the time and constantly taking care of yourself and loving yourself, then you're not going to be so tempted by those quick little pleasures that drop you out of that maintained higher state. And so the fastest way to begin changing your emotional state so that you can actually raise up into higher states of things like courage and acceptance and willingness and love and peace and joy and all those really, gratitude, all those really, really high emotions that just feel so amazing and feel much different than pleasure. And that's really important to recognize when a lot of people talk about focusing on what feels best. It's not about pleasure, because pleasure doesn't always feel good. And in fact, pleasure and pain exist on a lower separate scale than the emotions, because you can actually be in pain but feel good about it, and you could be in pleasure and feel good about it, or you could be in pleasure or pain and feel bad about it. So there's a context that wraps those, the content of pleasure and pain, a context that wraps it, that has a stronger effect on it, on influencing it. So for a quick example on that, if you go into the gym and you're pushing really hard, but you're excited to work your body and you're excited to move forward and to actually make some progress, well, there's going to be physical pain in the body, but you're going to be in a really positive emotional state because you want to go, you want to improve, you want to work your body, you want to have that exercise improving you. And so because that pain of the physical pain is wrapped in the context of that positive emotional field, it's actually it's pain, but it doesn't hurt. You know what I mean? It feels good. So that's always something to be keeping in mind, is that the emotional energy field that surrounds pleasure and pain does not necessarily mean that you're always trying to seek pleasure in feeling good. You always want to make sure that you're balancing it in a way that means that you're actually taking care of yourself and staying in that high emotional state that's geared towards the direction of things that you want, both for you and for the well-being of everybody that's around you. So the easiest way to start to change this, first of all, is to become aware of when you're in the negative emotional state. So, I probably talked about this before in previous videos or on podcasts, but when you're in a negative emotional state, if you have been raised your entire life that this is just the way things are, this is who you are, you're just an angry person when someone cuts you off in traffic, to use a very simple example. Well, every time you get angry, you're just going to think, that's just who I am. That's just the way the world is. People are terrible and rude to you, and so you have to be angry. And so you're in this constant state where you aren't necessarily recognizing that that's anger. And so it becomes so natural and so accustomed to you that you actually don't even pay attention to it. So the first step is start to become aware of your emotions. Start to recognize that you are not just a thinking being, you're actually a thinking, feeling being. And then taking that a step further, you're not a thinking being that feels, you're actually a feeling being that thinks. And this is a reversal of this paradigm that's really, really important, because the feelings always keep you on track. That context that I was talking about, if you're always feeling good, then the pain or pleasure that happens within the world is always going to be directed in the right direction. If you feel crappy about yourself, the pain and pleasure are always pointed in the opposite direction. It's always pointed in the wrong direction. For example, drug addictions, it's that pleasure. You have that pleasure, but you're not happy. You don't enjoy yourself. You're pointed in the wrong direction. You're not oriented properly in the world. So if you're in the paradigm that you're a thinking being that feels, then your thoughts can be jumping around to a bunch of different emotions all the time, because the thinking is primary and the feeling is secondary. And you can't ever really put your feet on the ground and walk in the right direction if that's the case. But when you flip that and you start to take account of your feelings, even though sometimes they're burdensome, they're slower than thinking, they require a lot more compassion, a lot more work, a lot more honesty, and a lot more truth and integrity. But if you start to orient yourself as a feeling being that thinks, then the feeling is the path and the thoughts just come around that path. All of your thinking now orients into this context of positivity, of love and gratitude and peace and all of those things that are pointing you in the right direction that's going to be best not only for you, but for everybody that's around you. Because as you lift yourself up, you now have more to share with other people. If you're that drug addict who just hates themselves and is tapping out on cheap pleasure all the time, well, you have nothing to offer anyone. If you're someone who is completely loving yourself and moves forward and is successful in your life and starts to make more money, well, now if somebody needs a little bit of help financially, you have the money. You have now raised yourself up to a place where you have more power to help others. And so that's the first step, is to start to become more aware of how you're feeling and to start to ground yourself in being a feeling being first, and then having the thoughts all align with the feelings to be the highest state of the feelings. Now, as you go through this, what you're going to find is that a lot of times you're going to be thinking thoughts or feeling feelings that are not positive, and yet you don't feel like you have any power to actually change them. And that's because you can't directly control the feelings. You can't just force yourself to change things, especially if there's been a habit ingrained for a very long time. So again, if you're angry all the time at getting cut off in traffic, you can't stop yourself from reacting to the person cutting you off, to being angry. You can't stop yourself from reacting because the reaction is automatic. It's ingrained into you as a habit, to the point where when it triggers, you feel the emotion right away. This is similar to Pavlov's dogs. Pavlov's dogs were the dogs that they rang a bell and then fed them. And they repeated this process, rang the bell, fed them, did it over and over and over until the response of ringing the bell would start to have the dogs salivate and increase their hunger, because they were ready to eat from this habit. The external stimulus now had ingrained an internal reaction. So if you're out in traffic and someone cuts you off, the internal reaction that's been ingrained into you is to get angry. So the work is not to force yourself not to react, but to become aware of how it is that you are reacting and no longer perpetuate it. Because every time that you catch yourself reacting and don't give into it, but instead stay expanded, which is to say the exact same thing of collapsing, when we were talking about the economy, collapsing into it. Instead of collapsing into the negative emotion, you stay spacious, you stay out and you just watch it and you become aware of what it is. Well, in due time, the momentum of that habit is going to start wearing down, and you're not going to continue reacting the same way anymore. And then a day will come when all of a sudden someone cuts you off and you don't feel angry. Instead, you might even think, oh wow, I wonder why that person's so upset. I wonder why they're having a bad day. Or maybe they're even just an angry person who is always out for themselves. And so you feel sort of, sad for them, because you're like, oh, I wish that you could be a happier person. It sucks that you're like that. But it doesn't change your emotional state. Those thoughts can all exist within that context of being in a really strong, positive mental state that's always going to be looking out for someone else. And so you can even see the immediate implications of that. If you're angry when someone cuts you off, you're going to want to react by honking your horn and exacerbating it and cutting them off and trying to get even. But if you see it as, if you don't collapse and you stay in that positive place, you're going to see their action as something that is about them and not about you. And because it's about them, you're going to want to help to try to pull them out of that state so that they're no longer continuing to perpetuate that poisonous emotional state out into the world. And of course, you can't help everyone. Everyone has to help themselves, but you can help people help themselves if they're ready for it. And so the basic rule here is that whenever you catch yourself reacting in a negative way to anything in the world, to always stay expanded, stay aware, stay present, watch the emotion, and just allow it to be, which is not always easy, of course. There's layer upon layer upon layer of this negative programming that's been built into you. But whatever layer is right in front of you, you can look at. And as you start to look at it, you'll start to unprogram yourself, dehabitualize yourself from those negative reactions to the point where now you will no longer be a reactionary organism, which really, if you want to think about it, means that you don't have any free will. You don't have any self-control because the reactions, the external world is causing you to react and to behave a certain way within the world. There's no free will in that. You're an automaton. You are a robot because the world can do anything to make you do something that it wants you to do. But when you start letting go of the reactions and now bring presence into it, you come to a clear space where now for the first time, you actually have the freedom of choice. You can now choose something different. And in fact, you can use this habitual mechanism of the mind to start orienting yourself in a direction that actually feels best for you, lifting you and everyone else around you. So this is the basic process of letting go, of acceptance, of allowing, of forgiveness. They're all basically the same words. You have to just see through the negative emotion as if you're looking through a dirty window and not getting distracted by the dirt, but seeing what's through the window. And as you do that, the window slowly starts to become clean and cleaner, clearer and clearer, cleaner and cleaner, until now you actually see things, not that you're forcing yourself to be loving and kind, but you actually see things with a perspective oriented properly so that you actually do feel love and peace and joy and gratitude and courage and want to lift yourself and the world, want to take care of yourself, want to take care of others, want to orient the world towards heaven and away from hell, rather than being in that collapsed state of self-pity and denial and guilt and shame and anger and fear and wanting to just punish the world for what it has done and punish yourself for how terrible you are, orienting the world towards hell. The more that you can see through this and forgive it and clean it and clear it, remain in that trust and not collapse into scarcity, the more that you can orient yourself and everyone else towards heaven. So I think that's a great place to end this. Thank you guys so much for watching. Please leave comments and like this video if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe so I can continue to be in touch with you with more informational videos like this, more inspirational videos like this. Please share it with anyone that you might like it, especially during this time with all the panic that's happening with Corona. I think it could be an important message for a lot of people. So please share this. I would really appreciate it. With all that, please stay aware, let go of your negativity, maintain the strength of the structure of your emotional and physiological self by maintaining the function and not collapsing into scarcity, hoarding, and excess. Help others if you can during this tough time, and the world will be oriented into a very positive direction. Thank you guys so much. Have a wonderful day. Peace.